Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey. She's Fulyana Osborne, and this is Inside Exec. Today we're talking with Trish Nicklin, and Fulyana is going to introduce her.
For the last 25 years, Trish has been working in corporate organisation, contributing to business success, to each organisation business success, through transformation and change and general leadership, which we'll hear a lot more about shortly. This was mainly in the finance industry, and Trish worked in Australian Stock Exchange, BNP Paribas Security Services, RBC, Dexia, Investor Services, JP Morgan Chase, Ord Minnett and Bankers Trust Company. At the moment, Trish has just got her new company and it's called Critical Q. She is the owner and founder of that company and I'm very excited about it, so we're dying to hear more about that. Trish is also a board member with Australian Transformation and Turnaround Association and a president and a chair of the Dragon Boat New South Wales, again, on top of all the things that Trish is doing, as well as studying, which we'll hear about. She's also involved in a very exciting sport as well. So welcome.
Thank you. It's such a long list when you listen to it.
It's impressive, isn't it?
I sound old.
No, you sound accomplished.
Yes, I should say it's sort of deeply enriched experience.
Yes.
Sort of embedded inside.
We won't go on the chronological measure because that's not.
No.
And it's interesting actually that you bring that up so early because really it's not a measure. I think that there are ends of the scale where when you're first coming into the workforce you feel that it's a measure and you don't want it to be because you're out to change the world and you're going to fix everything. And I think we do as a society have a tendency towards the end of the chronological scale to discount information that might be coming that way. We'll say, yes, we should learn from people's experiences and they're full of knowledge and all the rest of it, but really life is different today. We have to do it differently and it's not the same as when it was for them, and so we don't hear the messages as clearly as we should. So an interesting topics to start with.
I think for me too is I'm looking at younger people coming through, we say coming through the ranks, which is such a bias anyway. It's a structural bias, which is exactly the type of thing it's a paradigm I'm trying to fight. This concept of you have to have this sequence of experience is now being really challenged. And for those of us that are in those Generation X and baby boomers, we're struggling with that because that was what we were raised in the, in a corporate mindset to you walk up the ladder and it's notches on the bedpost equivalent in a CV. Really?
Absolutely. I mean, we're public sector trained and you knew in the 70s and 80s that you'd look around the room and you'd say, oh, well, that person will go up next because they've been here longer than me. And sometimes it was only a week's difference, but you knew that the pecking order was such that didn't matter what the promotion was or how well you knew the job, it was their turn.
And now that's all being turned on its head and people are saying, I'd rather someone with a better idea or a new idea. Although I caveat that by saying there's still plenty out there that are struggling with that. I was thinking about this morning, about this, how many innovators are out there in these organisations that are struggling to be heard because the right to innovate is still under title.
We talked with one of our previous guests about being an entrepreneur in an organisation and how you go about that and how you can accomplish that. It's interesting that you're seeing that as well.
Very much so, and it's easier, but it's also harder because it's still a class effect. And some people, if you're pinpointed and you're permissioned to go there, then you can. But it's all the other people that aren't permissioned. And so it's how do organisations change their entire thinking to permissioning people. And one of the things that I'm looking at doing, or that my business does, one of the programs I run, is about how to run a freelance economy within an organisation. And I think that's a really exciting prospect, to take that model out that is outside, but actually put it within a boundary so it's relatively safe, you know, from a shareholder point of view, if that's where we're objecting. But yeah, I guess for me, I should add that I'm no longer president of Dragon Boats New South Wales. I came off that board last year and then went on to the Australian Transformation and Turnaround.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite as doubling up, but it was that was a really exciting phase of my life. That's where I did most of my transformation work comparative to what I had done in my professional career. And the sole difference, I was putting a bit of thought into this last night as well, the sole difference was that I had that permission. Or in other words, nobody said no, and there was a lot of support from a board behind me. And that brings me to that next topic, which is of support and sponsorship, which is really important for people, because you can't progress in an organisation unless somebody is leveraging you forward, upward, forward, around, or going into bat for you. That is really important, and that needs to change, because there are some wonderful people out there with magnificent ideas that just may not be sponsored.
And so do you see that as a responsibility of the individual or the organisation?
Oh, that's a really good question. I see it as both, but I think if you're an individual with great ideas and you just don't have the resources or the sponsorship to point them forward, then you can become disheartened and demotivated so easily. Likewise, the other example that I've seen a lot is your ideas get lifted and adopted and taken on by somebody else. And that's, again, very demotivating.
Without recognition. And
Without,
to the fact
or
that
even if there is a bit of recognition.
Yeah.
It's a tap on the shoulder. You know, Charlie came up with this amazing idea and we're going to take it forward. But when the promotion and the bonus is handed out, or when the person that gets up there and presents it across the organisation is not Charlie, that's, to me, where an organisation really has some shoes to fill. And that's where my favourite topic of leadership comes in, because we've got a lot of leadership training happening out there, but we're not solving these very real problems and we're not acknowledging them as much as we should be. There's a lot of ticking around the edges and grasping of little bits and pieces, and we're doing employee engagement surveys, and we're asking, but there's still this measure of control.
So if we look at leadership in and of itself, when should training for leadership start?
That's a great question. Probably in the womb, I would say, if it's not too early.
No, I genuinely think that we leave it too late.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And we train, again, we do it in schools. In primary school is when you start to think about leadership. And we have a structure. And there are still prefects and monitors, and there's set principled roles. That sometimes there's a democratic vote, sometimes there's not. You're appointed or you're given the option by a higher authority. And I think that sets that precedent for you have to be in a certain mould. And so then we start this process of exclusion.
And it cuts out other people who don't get selected in that process.
Exclusion is the cancer. To innovation,
Yep.
I believe. And I think that we do exclusion very well. We teach it very, very well.
In a sense, we focus on exclusion,
Oh,
and
yeah.
whatever else comes through is just lucky.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're the ones
podium
who will
finish.
push them.
See, we're not encouraging the idea of saying you lead from any chair, from any position, at any age, in any circumstance, and that's up to you. We're saying almost like in your description of, say, the school, you're saying you're not in that position, so that's nothing to do with you. And
you're
that's
not
the
allowed.
exclusion.
You're not allowed to hand out
Yes.
hall passes. You're not allowed to do things. And some schools are working around it. That's not to say that they're not. They might cycle, so that you might do it for a term and then it's somebody else's role. But there's also labour and resource in this teaching, which is where I find this new way of working around these sort of if you look at Zappos and Tony Shea, his example of holacracy, which is about everything is a project and you bid for your place on the project. And in one project you're leading it, and in another project you're making the coffee.
Yes.
And you're working on a number of them at any time, and it's one of those
Yes.
You know, agile's become a big word. That's one of the methods, but it's this idea of these circles going around, and I think that is answering that question because it's playing to strengths.
Yes,
And
definitely.
something that I read the other day, and I was talking about to some people earlier this week, which I thought was really profound, and we should be teaching this actually to everybody, not only in schools but in corporate life as well, and in any working sector. But we excel in life by maximising our strengths, not by fixing our weaknesses. And this term, fix your weakness, really struck a chord with me, because if I look at the entire time I've spent in different work, and including volunteer work and not-for-profits, somebody gives you an assessment at some point, performance reporting, performance measurement, and there's always this pointing out
Of a weakness.
a weakness. You can call it, you can wrap it up in pleasant terms like, let's look at what we can improve.
Challenges. We have these
Challenges.
challenges.
Let's
Lovely word.
Let's look at your opportunities and what they fail. This whole process completely fails to do is it becomes a judgment as opposed to an acknowledgement. So first of all, the conversation should be: what is a weakness? Let's call it what it is, right?
Yes.
It's a weakness and we don't like it and we want you to change. We think you're not presenting well enough and your role is in sales and you need to present well enough. So there needs to be a conversation around, well, who's setting that standard? What does it look like? Where am I not meeting it? What is the measure?
Is there also opportunity then? Because my feeling is that weaknesses are identified by someone else.
Yes.
Certainly you identify weaknesses yourself,
Yeah.
but when you identify weaknesses yourself, you discard them unless you really think that it's something that you need to do.
Unless you're driven to change it.
But you're driven to change it for a reason.
Yeah.
So there's some other motive apart from an external judge. So my feeling is that you discard the weaknesses and that you play to your strengths.
Yeah.
Because your strengths are what you're good at. Often it's what you enjoy. And so in that situation where someone says to me, look, we think, you're weak in this area, I'll say, I'm strong in all these areas. You find me things to do that are strong in all these areas, or we don't have an arrangement because I want to work to my strengths because that's what I'm good at and that's where I think I can give the contribution. The weaknesses are your assessment, and if that's what you need, then you need someone else. You don't need me.
And that's where we're not. So this is what I find is exactly what you just discussed, is where we're seeing younger people are doing that. And they're saying, well, if that's what you want, I can't meet that. Whereas I know for me, I would sit there and take it or be horrified and feel shame and then try and adjust it.
So, but you're taking on the
And
story.
I took, I remember being told, not a few jobs ago, but for a long time, I was told I rattled on too long, talked too much. And I can't tell you how much effort I put into trying to change that. And I probably learnt a lot, and I developed. I slowed down my speech, I sped up my speech, I changed my speech, I tried it in different languages, I wrote it down, I tossed it out, I dictated it, I did everything I could. And in the end, I tore myself up in knots, and at some point I just thought, this is how I am. And I'm getting good success. I've got great relationships with all these people I'm dealing with.
What concerns me about society generally at the moment, and it links into leadership, it's about responsibility.
Yeah.
So where do we, in terms of leadership and the leadership models that we have at the moment, where do we start sharing the idea of responsibility, individual and organisational responsibility?
And I think a lot of that comes down to making leadership simple. Because like many things, leadership, it's just a term, that it's a buzzword, and at the moment there's so many theories on it that we've made it quite complicated so that people have twisted it inside and out, turned it upside down so that they can make careers out of teaching it. And that's not to say that it's not valued to look at it. And I got a great deal of value myself when I started to study leadership, and I looked at the history of leadership theory, and I could go from great man theory right through to current post-structural, post-heroic theory and see what had evolved. But what I found in that process was the horror that where I was in my career, we were still teaching stuff that was 30 years old.
And teaching it as dogma.
And teaching it as dogma. And recently said in an article that we tend to take these Cotter models, you know, with no poor old John Cotter, I give him quite a bit of grief. I know he's reviewing his models now, but we take all these standard models and we just pull them out of the textbook, and like a jumper over a screaming child that's no longer fits it, but grandma's coming and we need to show that we're wearing it, we shove these models over the employees and we say, this will do. And so there's all these people just caught in the crosshairs. So it is an individual thing. And so to try and answer your question, I know I'm rambling, as I found you. I think we will get somewhere when we stop trying to put Band-Aid solutions onto it.
Give us a flavour of what you think we should be doing in that space instead of just going old models, because I tend to agree with you as far as, for example, we're talking about people's strengths and weaknesses, and we do have some methodology for like performance reviews. You can talk about your weaknesses and strengths, and your manager can as well, and then you work to solution. The opposite side of what you were saying earlier is some people make their weaknesses much bigger than what they really are because they're humble. And to me, I've seen that where you say, no, actually, here's examples of you are really good at this. And then so it's a responsibility of both parties. But tell us about leadership, the right model for now, compared to what we've been using as historic or outdated maybe.
Yeah, so I think what we tend to do is we tend to go back into what we call adaptive, or adaptive is a new term for situational leadership on one side. So the manager will say, I'm a situational leader, so therefore if you are
It's a bit like being a method
I
actor.
know, if you are a quiet person, I will work with you. If you are an introvert, I will understand that. If you are an extrovert and you want to go and do lots of presentations, I'll work with you to make that happen. I will duck and weave, and then together we will do the same with the organisation and the challenges facing the organisation, and we'll do all that, which is really hard thing to do, I think, and almost near impossible. So we have that happening on one side, and then what we ask is that the employee does the same thing. So if I'm going high, I need you to come high with me, and if I'm going low, I need you to come low with me. But the problem is that's impossible to do across so many individuals, and it's impossible then to meet the requirement as it flows up. It's just not scalable. And so what happens is it gets lost. So we walk out of the conversation, and then what happens is the manager then goes off, has a cup of coffee, and then goes into the next one. And so where are you? You're sort of in the back of the brain, and it takes a certain type of person to be able to love their employees at that very individual level, as well as loving the organisation as well. That's what we've been doing, and how we can change that is by, I think, breaking down a lot of these structures within organisations that then require all of that.
Because it's that management and that leadership at every level. So it's this mess of soup.
It's like running through hurdles of jelly that just gets thicker and thicker and thicker as you go, until you're not running anymore. You're just sort of trying to punch a hole through a concrete wall. So if we look at this startup community, and they're just throwing all of that stuff out the window, everything out the window, and they're still thriving. And when they don't thrive, they don't care.
No, move on to the
they
next
just
thing.
move on to the next thing. And it's such a wonderful thing, and I think that's where that future piece comes in. I think you've got to almost put a match to it, and then come back and start again. And there's this concept around leaderless leadership, and the best example I've got of that is the hashtag. It just is one person with an idea, or two people with an idea. They start it, hashtag leadership. And suddenly it grows into a thing. Everyone's on board, it's trending, and it fizzles and dies, and it may regrow as something else, but it becomes a living, breathing, moving forward, noisy. And
there's contribution. There's contribution from everywhere.
Yeah.
And there's no there's no path that you have to follow to contribute.
Yeah.
You don't have to get approval all the way along the way.
No.
You can just throw in your idea or your opinion or your spin on whatever it is, and then move on to the next thing. And so there's that much more engagement, and that much more opportunity to move an organisation forward or to gather ideas or to find a solution than there would be in the traditional role.
And that's why you look at things like, that's exactly what Twitter and Facebook are doing, is you don't have to have a title to be published.
Yes.
And you can have a say. And that's what WordPress is doing in the publishing industry. Some fan fictions have come out. Because in the past you would write it, but you'd have to submit it to a newspaper editor.
And it may or may not make it.
Yeah, and someone would make a judgment over it.
Yes.
And there's all, as we said, there's good and bad in it, but the beauty of it is that it's really evened up the field.
It's interesting too that we hear a lot of talk about social media particularly being the death of interaction, and yet I think that it's not. I think that it engages more people, and I don't think it disengages them from face-to-face communication either, because there's not that many more things to talk about. Did you see? Have you seen? Have you heard?
Look at fandom.
Let me show you this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in a fandom, and I found, like friends in there.
What's a fandom?
A fandom is if you are a big fan, say, of a certain actor or actress or Game of Thrones or a particular TV show, you can start looking at hashtags around that and find people who have the same interests and engage with them. And I've ended up with some wonderful friends all around the world. Many times I've flown across Australia or had people fly into Sydney, and we've caught up and gone to film festivals together. We've gone shopping together, had catch-ups. I know girls that, go and congregate, and guys that all go and meet at the big Comic Cons.
So you've got an interest in common, and that could be entertainment, but it could be business ideas, it could be anything.
It could be anything. And Facebook groups are great for that. I'm in one for people who are starting up new businesses at the moment, which is hosted by Naomi Simpson from Shark Tank. And she said, I'm going to set this up so you all can start talking. And
so this is a forum for anyone who's starting their business, and it's an interaction of experience and all of that?
It's anything. Excellent. It's anything that you want. It's the old, you use the right term, forums. In the beginning, I remember 15 years ago, you would have forums on websites where people could put it. And now we just have threads and Facebook pages and groups and things. But it isn't. Again, it's so much easier to get access.
And access to a broader range of people, a broader range of experience.
It's very humbling, I think, when you realise that you have a lot of things in common with people who are have completely different lives to you. And that you can enrich in each other's lives. I mean, there's also the very dark side of all of that, where there are a lot of people who take advantage of that situation.
But that's no different to society outside of electronics.
Absolutely. And there are many
that just
people,
makes it bigger and faster, the technology.
It's bigger and it's faster, and sometimes it's nasty.
It's more obvious. It's just more obvious. And is that not a good thing, that we are starting to be more careful about our safety personally, about our standards across society generally? So I can't see that in any sense there's any detriment to anything.
We're teaching the same lessons about sticks and stones will break your bones. That's exactly the same, but it's just that the playground has moved.
It's a different venue.
And I think that there's opportunities now in terms of leadership. And so what I'm looking at is, if we then take this back to that prism of work, is all of this is going on in life. And life has moved. It's shifted onto this entire new dynamic. But we're still running businesses and organisations with these old style mindsets. They're sort of bogged down And regulation has a part to play in that, but it can't be an excuse.
But it's not just businesses, because if you look at families, they're run the same way.
And there's still that old patriarchal matriarch. Still, I'm in my mid-40s. My parents still try and tell me what I can and can't do. You know,
my eldest son is, we'll work out the years, he's 36. And still, when he gets to a point where it's the but why, and I gave him a card when he was about 10 that said 10 reasons that your mother will give you for doing things, and number 10 is just because, and I only have to say to him now, number 10, boy, just remember number 10.
Well, it's the same. I mean, I may say my parents still try and tell me what to do, but likewise, I still go to them. That's the first or second call I make when I need help or advice or guidance.
Yes.
And that was instilled.
So that was my next question, is your management style something that you develop into, when we talked about the school years and how you might get selected to be a leader in that time, but your management style, or what you think your management style is going to be if you're coming into the workforce now, is that something that is a reflection of mentors, for want of a better word?
You copy it.
Yeah.
Copy it until you know otherwise. You copy what you've seen. The first real example we have of that is that family around the dining room table, the parents at each end. That was, we were growing up, there were sitcoms and that was always the way it was done. And then you go to school and you're sitting there and there is somebody standing in front instructing you. And that's how we're raised. So we can then go into organisations where the teacher's desk is replaced by a corner office or a better seat. And what we're seeing now is less of that. We're seeing more rounder tables.
Well, people don't sit at a dining table at home anymore.
No.
Very rarely.
No, and it's becoming, it's really starting to change the dynamic, and yet in schools we're still instructing, although classrooms have changed. My daughter's in year 5 and there's only 2 desks in the room, but there's bean bags and there's high tables and low tables, and the kids just choose where they sit, which is starting to teach this different style. No longer a desk. Teachers' desks are either at the back of the room if they've got one at all. That is going to create much, I think, of a more inclusive future, and why we're seeing this changing at work.
But it also creates an issue in the workplace of change, because you've got a generation coming through who want to manage in this more organic way, working for, at this point in time, a generation who were schooled a different way.
Well, they're not working for them, as far as I can see. So I'm looking at a lot of organisations that are struggling to have young people come in.
Okay.
They come in, they might come in for a while, but they're not sticking around.
Yeah.
There's that somebody's bemoaned there's no loyalty. And it's like they just don't see the value. It's not that there's no loyalty. If you create
it's not about loyalty, it's about the environment where you can thrive and be innovative. And I think it's that.
And be supported.
And have everyone doing their best within their natural abilities as well as learn.
We've actually gone a little bit longer than we normally would, so we might stop and take a break here. For now, I'm Kim Bailey, she's Fulyana Osborne, and we're talking with Trish Nicklin, and this is Inside Exec.